When a marriage ends after nearly 3 decades, the world doesn't wait to form an opinion. It doesn't pause. It doesn't ask for context. The judgments arrive fast and loud, the kind that take shape, before anyone really understands what happened, before the silence between two people has had any chance to become something honest. Hugh Jackman had spent years being one of the most genuinely admired men in Hollywood, not just for the roles he played or the awards that followed them, for something harder to manufacture: the image of a man who came home, the devoted husband, the present father, the one who spoke about his family in interviews with a warmth that didn't feel rehearsed. And in a world where almost everything feels rehearsed, that mattered to people. It mattered more than most of them probably realized. And Deborra-Lee had been beside him for all of it, through the lean years before the fame arrived, through the decades when everything around them shifted and expanded into something neither of them could have fully anticipated, through a life built carefully and publicly enough that millions of people came to feel. They understood it, came to feel, in some small way, that they were part of it. Then came September 2023, a brief statement, controlled, issued through a spokesperson in the practiced way of people trying to manage something that keeps threatening to exceed what management can contain. The marriage was over. 27 years, and almost before the words had settled, the world moved on to the next chapter, the one about who Hugh was seen with, where he was going, what his future apparently looked like now that the old one had been set aside. Deborra-Lee went quiet. For months, she said almost nothing. She moved through the public eye with a stillness that was noticed precisely because of what it didn't contain. No statements, no interviews, no visible reaction to a story that was growing louder around her every single week. And then, eventually, she spoke. What she said, and the particular way she chose to say it, landed differently than anyone seemed to be expecting. Not with anger, not with the bitterness the moment might have licensed, not like someone trying to win something quieter than all of that. And because of that, something that hit considerably harder. There's a specific kind of love story that the public decides it owns. It doesn't happen with every couple, only the ones who let people in. The ones who talk about each other in interviews with a naturalness that doesn't feel staged, who appear together in ways that suggest the cameras are incidental to what's actually happening between them. The couples who make ordinary people feel, watching from a careful distance, that something real is possible, that love in the middle of an extraordinary, relentless, pressure-filled life can still look like the thing it's supposed to be. Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee were that kind of couple to an enormous number of people. They met in 1995 on the set of an Australian television series. He was relatively unknown at the time, talented, clearly, but not yet the person he was going to become. She was the established one, a respected actress who had built a career with the kind of quiet credibility that takes real years and genuine skill to earn. By most accounts, what happened between them was immediate and uncomplicated in the way that significant things sometimes are before you fully understand what you're standing inside. They married in April 1996. She was 40. He was 27. The age gap was noted, as these things always are, and then largely set aside as the years accumulated and the marriage continued with a consistency that made the early commentary feel entirely beside the point. They adopted 2 children, Oscar and Ava, and built a family life that both of them spoke about with a specificity and warmth that felt like the real foundation beneath everything else. As Hugh's career ascended into something genuinely rare, the particular altitude of global stardom that very few people in any generation actually reach, Deborra-Lee remained a presence beside him that resisted simple categorization. She was not a Hollywood wife in the way that phrase tends to imply. She had her own work, her own convictions, causes she pursued with a commitment that had nothing to do with proximity to a famous husband. She advocated. She spoke publicly. She moved through the world as someone who had a distinct sense of herself that existed independently of the man she had chosen to build a life with. And through all of it, across all the years and pressures and distances that a life like theirs accumulates, the marriage appeared to hold. In an industry where relationships dissolve with a regularity that makes longevity feel almost defiant, 27 years felt like a statement about something. People pointed to it. They cited it the way you cite evidence for a position you need to believe in. Evidence that some things could survive extraordinary fame. That two people could remain genuinely present to each other through long absences. Through a life lived partly in transit. Through all the forces that quietly pull people in different directions whether they intend to drift or not. Which is part of why the announcement landed the way it did. Not only as the end of a relationship between two particular people, but as the quiet collapse of something great many others had been holding as proof of something worth believing in, before any of it, before the statements and searches and the headlines that came in waves. There was just a life being lived, a long one by any measure, full in the ways that actually count, even when the details weren't visible from the outside people who were around. Hugh and Deborra-Lee during the years before his fame became the defining and dominant fact of his existence describe a relationship that felt genuinely grounded in a way that was uncommon in the environment surrounding them. She was the person who had known him before any of it, before Wolverine, before the global press tours and the transformation into one of the most recognizable human faces on the planet. She carried a knowledge of him that predated all of that, and there is something in that kind of shared history, the kind that begins before someone becomes who they eventually become, that doesn't easily find a replacement. In interview after interview, year after year across decades of extraordinary public exposure, Hugh spoke about Deborra-Lee with a consistency that was genuinely difficult to read as performance. He credited her. He returned to her in conversations about what had sustained him through the parts that were hard. She was present in his public life not as an obligation or an accessory, but as someone he appeared to want people to understand had been essential to whatever he had built, and whoever he had become. She spoke about the marriage differently, more directly, less sentimentally, in a way that made her feel credible to the people who paid attention. She talked about it as something real, something with weight and history and the kind of ordinary, accumulated difficulty that long relationships develop over time. Not a fairy tale requiring protection from reality, a real thing. And that distinction mattered because the people who watched her could sense the difference between someone performing a marriage and someone actually living one. Their children appeared to anchor both of them in ways that were visible even across the managed distance of public life. Deborra-Lee, in particular, had been vocal for years about adoption, about what it meant to her family, about the systems that she believed needed changing, about the children she felt the world was failing. It was advocacy rooted deeply in the personal, and personal advocacy of that kind tends to reveal character in ways that more polished, prepared statements simply don't. For 27 years, the picture held, not without complications. Nothing real survives that long without complication, but solidly, durably, in a way that seemed, to everyone watching from outside, to reflect a genuine and repeated choice being made by two people who had more reason than most to drift apart and had continued, year after year, to choose otherwise. What lived behind that picture, the private conversations, the accumulating distances, the texture of those years that was never available to anyone on the outside, belongs only to the people who actually lived it. But the picture itself had become part of how a great many people understood what this kind of life could look like. And when it changed, the weight of that change extended far beyond the two people at its center. September 2023, the statement was brief, a joint announcement through a representative, confirming what the headline would say, 27 years, and now a separation. The language was careful, warm in the calibrated way of things written for public consumption by people who understand that millions will read it within minutes, and that every word will be examined. They asked for privacy. They expressed love for each other and for their family. In the landscape of celebrity endings, it was, relatively speaking, a dignified document. And then, almost before it had finished settling, it was overtaken. Because the story did not wait. It never does. Within days, Hugh was being photographed alongside Sutton Foster, a Broadway actress, someone he had been working with. A friendship now being examined with the particular and relentless intensity that surrounds any visible relationship when a long marriage has just publicly ended. The photographs were framed as significant. The proximity was narrated with implication, and the story accelerated past both people at its center, before either of them appeared to have any real opportunity to shape something that had been real without reducing it to a prelude to betrayal. She talked about her children and her own life with a forward-facing clarity that made the noise surrounding her feel, briefly, very small. And she addressed Hugh's reported next chapter, his movement toward something new, toward what was being described as a potential wedding, in terms that were measured in a way that cost something visible and landed, for many people, much harder than anger would have. According to reports of her words, she expressed something complicated, not cruelty and not performed graciousness, something that reflected the actual, unglamorous reality of watching someone you spent decades with begin to build a different life, in full public view. That kind of honesty, the kind that doesn't perform and doesn't protect and doesn't resolve neatly, said more about who she is than anything the months of media coverage had managed to say about her. When someone has been quiet for a long time and finally chooses to speak, something shifts in how the words land. Restraint earns a kind of authority that immediacy doesn't. The choice to wait, to let the noise reach its peak and begin to settle before adding your own voice to it, tells you something about a person that the words themselves sometimes can't. When Deborra-Lee's fuller comments began to surface, they carried two kinds of weight simultaneously: the weight of what she was actually saying, and the weight of everything she had not said during the months that preceded them. What emerged, according to those who were present for it or reporting on it, was not managed. It was not a set of talking points engineered to shift a narrative or rehabilitate an image. It felt, by the accounts of people who heard it, more unguarded than that. She talked about 27 years without weaponizing them. She acknowledged, with a directness that was clearly hers, that people change, that the relationship that begins between two people in 1995 at specific points in their lives is not the same relationship that exists in 2023, reshaped by fame and time and everything that accumulates in a life whether you invite it or not. What she did not do, and this, according to reports, was clear, was position herself as a victim inside a story that had been very busily written for her. She pushed against that framing, quietly but firmly, and in doing so, she said something more interesting and more difficult than the confirmation the world had been waiting for. Her words about Hugh's reported upcoming wedding were described by those who heard them as containing a sadness that was fully honest, the kind that doesn't perform itself and doesn't ask for recognition, a sadness that existed alongside something that looked, to those present, like genuine acceptance, not the kind of acceptance that gets performed to appear noble, the quieter, harder one kind that comes from doing the actual internal work of making peace with something you didn't choose and wouldn't have chosen. That distinction is not small. Performed acceptance leaves traces, small fractures in the composure, moments where the effort becomes briefly visible beneath the surface. What people describe encountering in Deborra-Lee during this period doesn't carry those traces. It sounds like someone who arrived somewhere real and was willing to speak about it honestly, at some personal cost, in a way that most people in her exact position would have found a reason not to. The narrative that tends to form around celebrity separations almost always centers on the wrong things. It asks who left and who stayed, who appears happier in photographs, who the public should root for, and who they should view with suspicion. It attempts to reduce something that existed for 27 years, something with an entire private architecture of history and difficulty and genuine connection, into a clean story with a clearly assignable verdict. What Deborra-Lee has been pushing toward, in the words that have emerged and in the way she has carried herself through this period, is something that resists that reduction. A story in which the marriage ending does not erase what the marriage was, in which a woman whose life has been profoundly changed by something she did not fully choose is also, at the same time, the author of what comes next, not simply a supporting character in a story belonging to someone else. She has kept working. She has continued the advocacy that has been genuinely central to her public identity for years, not as distraction, but as the expression of a self that has always existed independently of her marriage. She has given interviews about things she cares about that have nothing to do with Hugh or the separation. That insistence on a life that exists beyond and outside the ended relationship is not accidental. It reflects a clear-eyed understanding of the trap that public sympathy can quietly become, the way in which being seen as the one who was hurt can shrink a person's entire story to the dimensions of what was done to them. She understands that trap. She appears to be refusing it, deliberately and at some effort. What she has said about the wedding, about knowing it is coming, about sitting with what it means to watch someone she shared nearly 3 decades with begin something new with full public visibility, has been described by those close to the situation as measured in a way that clearly required something from her, because measured is not the same as unfeeling. It means the feeling is present and real, and has been engaged with honestly rather than buried or turned into something sharper. That kind of sustained emotional discipline, under the specific pressure of this much public exposure, is uncommon. No complete account of everything she has said or felt has been formally confirmed. The private interior of all of this, the full truth of it, belongs to her and is not available to anyone outside it. But what has come through, in the fragments that have surfaced, suggests a person who is navigating the most publicly observed period of her life, with a depth of character that the coverage surrounding her has rarely managed to reflect. The world tends to want a particular kind of ending from a story like this one, something that resolves cleanly, the version in which the wronged person either visibly breaks or rises in triumphant, quotable form, the version in which the other person is either redeemed or confirmed as the villain, the version that closes in a way that lets the audience feel they understood everything that mattered. Real life doesn't produce that version. It produces something messier and less satisfying and considerably more true. What Deborra-Lee offered, in the words she eventually chose and in the long, careful silence she maintained before choosing them, was something untidy and honest in the way that genuinely difficult human experiences tend to be. A portrait of a person moving through real loss while remaining, at the same time, fully present to her own life, not shattered, not performing recovery, somewhere in the complicated, unglamorous space between those two poles, where most of actual human experience quietly takes place and where almost none of the coverage about her managed to look. The 27 years were real. They made a family that both people still speak about with evident and unperformed love. They contained everything that long relationships contain, the seasons that sustain you, the ones that cost you, the invisible structure of shared history that nobody outside a relationship can fully see or accurately describe. What ended was real. What it has cost her is something she alone fully knows. And what she is choosing to build from this point forward is, by her own clear insistence, something she alone gets to determine. There is something worth staying with in the way she has handled all of this. Not because it was without pain. Pain of this kind and at this scale doesn't get handled painlessly, but because it was honest in a way that public life very rarely rewards or even recognizes. She did not give the world the performance it was positioned to receive. She gave it something harder to package and more worth having. The truth of a person moving through something real, at full weight, without disappearing into it. Hugh Jackman's life has continued forward in ways that are visible and widely reported. A new relationship, a new chapter arriving in the brightness that new beginnings tend to carry publicly. Whatever the more complex private reality turns out to be, that public chapter is now something Deborra-Lee simply has to know exists. Something she encounters in headlines and images and the casual, structurally indifferent machinery of an information environment that was not built to protect anyone's interior life. That she has faced that reality and spoken about it, not loudly, not with the heat the moment might have justified, but with a particular and costly quiet honesty, is its own form of courage, less visible than other kinds, less rewarded by the systems designed to measure and celebrate these things, but entirely real and perhaps more lasting for being less performed. The story of who she is, independently and going forward. The story that belongs to her rather than to the marriage the world decided to own, is still actively being written. It will take shapes none of us can anticipate from here. But what she has already demonstrated, in the way she has moved through the most watched and most scrutinized passage of her private life, is that the person holding the pen is fully present, clear-eyed, grounded in herself in a way that the noise around her has not managed to erode. She is not done yet, not even close. If something in this landed with you, her silence, her words, the particular and quiet kind of strength it takes to move through,